Morning. Thanks, Jeremy, for sharing. I'd like to build off of that a little bit. So the thing that I've been learning recently is to take much more seriously the sin of doubt, the sin of unbelief towards God. And why is that such an important thing? I think if you ask people in the world today, is it such a big deal to be worried about something? It's kind of natural, right? That's what you do. You just worry about things in life. But it might not be a big deal for people in the world, but for those of us who claim that we have a Father in heaven, it is an extremely big deal. And that's just something I've been learning to take a bit more seriously in my life. So, for example, let's say I have a kid. I don't have a kid, obviously, but let's say I had a son, and one day the son says, "Dad, I'm really worried." And I said, "Why? Why are you so worried?" I said, "Well, I'm worried I might not get breakfast today." I'm like, "What are you talking about? I've gotten breakfast all the time." Or, "I'm worried I'm not going to be able to have a ride to school." It's like, really? You're really that worried about that? And it's just a small picture, but that's kind of what we're saying to God when we doubt or when we worry. And that's why I want to treat this as a much bigger deal and treat it much more seriously. So having said that as an intro, I'd like to turn to Mark chapter 16. So Mark chapter 16, verse 14. The context for this verse is, this is the time when the disciples abandoned Jesus. Jesus was captured, he was crucified, and he was raised, and some people saw Jesus resurrected, and they told the disciples. And this is the time when Jesus appears to the disciples. And we look at what Jesus says to them. In verse 14 it says, "Afterwards he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at the table, and he reproached them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen." So think about what just happened. In a sense, you could say the disciples made two types of mistakes. The first type of mistake they said they made was they abandoned Jesus, and Peter even denied Jesus. So you could sense that's one type of mistake. The other type of mistake they said they made was that they didn't believe that Jesus had risen from dead after other people told them that they saw him. So if you were to compare those two mistakes, which one would you say is the bigger mistake? I don't know about you, but for me, I would have thought it's a much bigger deal to have denied Jesus and to have abandoned him, because for someone to have been raised from the dead, it's a bit of a miracle. I can't quite fault them for not believing it, but I would say, I would argue that the former was a bit of a greater mistake. But look what Jesus reproaches them on. Notice that word reproach in there. Reproach is a very strong word, like a very strong word. He's absolutely just like yelling at them. He's like, "Guys, what's going on?" And what is he reproaching them for? He's not reproaching them for abandoning them or even denying him. The one thing that he approaches them for is for their hardness of heart, for their unbelief, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen. So we can see the heart of Jesus there, that the one thing that he really wanted these disciples to be able to take was to have an absolute solid rock faith in Jesus. And we see that throughout his life as well. The thing that really impressed Jesus, or the thing that really always surprised him, was faith. He's always surprised when someone had a lot of faith, or he was surprised when someone had no faith. But faith was that one thing that he really wanted to drill inside these disciples and make sure they had a rock solid foundation on. And the thing that encourages me is actually the next verse. Because what happens in verse 15? Well, verse 15, he starts talking about the Great Commission. Can you just imagine? He just finishes reproaching these people, and the next thing he says is, here's the Great Commission, and that's a tremendous task that he's given the disciples to do. So the takeaway for me when I saw that was, Lord, these disciples, their faith wasn't that strong, but they were sincere, they were wholehearted, and despite that lack of faith, Jesus was still willing to work with them. And for me, that's a big encouragement, because my faith might not be 100% yet, but nevertheless, Jesus is still willing to work with us to get us to that point. Because the one thing I think those disciples had was they were really wholehearted. So the thing that I was trying to think about this week was, it's one thing to be wholehearted and not have maybe a rock solid faith. And that might be fine for maybe a starting point. But what Jesus really wants us to have is both. Have both a wholeheartedness and both an absolute solid faith in him. So that's something I was learning this week, and just wanted to, again, take much more seriously this whole thing of worrying and doubting, and just really believe if we really have a Heavenly Father and he is who he says he is, then how should I react in different situations? So that's all. Thank you.